In today's video, we're going to be going over some tips and tricks for the Tearlaments deck that you should know whether you're trying to play the deck or playing in this format, so you can have a better understanding of how and where to stop your opponent. Without any further ado, we're just going to hop straight into the very first thing. Starting with the Tearlaments monsters, the very first one I want to talk about is Tearlaments Haveness. Tearlaments Haveness' effect can actually be used during both players' turns. So the first effect, of course, being when your opponent activates a monster effect on the field, you can special summon it and then send the top 3 cards from your deck to the graveyard. Why this is important is because going second into certain matchups where you suspect they may have a card like Triple Tactics Talents, it can be beneficial to actually hold Haveness until your turn, or just not use it at all during their turn, because you don't want to risk playing into a card like Triple Tactics Talents. So for example, if you go into a deck like Sprite or Mathmech, of course they're going to use monster effects on their first turn, but they also usually end on cards that let them use monster effects during your turn. So in the case of Sprite, totally awesome during the standby phase to summon a frog. You can chain your Haveness then and there. Against Mathmech, when they use something like Decotalk or Heat Soul, you can chain your Haveness then and there. This just helps you play around a card like Triple Tactics Talents game 1, because more times than not, your opponent, when they know you're on Tearlaments, is most likely going to side out Triple Tactics Talents, just because they know that you're likely not going to be playing too many hand traps, and that can be a very, very good thing for you, because that means you can use Haveness in games 2 and 3 more liberally on your opponent's turn without fear of having to play into a card like Triple Tactics Talents. The next card we're going to be talking about is Tearlaments Rhinoheart, and the important thing about Rhinoheart is that you can send any Tearlaments card from your hand to the graveyard to summon it back when it's sent to the graveyard. So that means you can send the traps from your hand to the grave, which can be important if, let's say, you drew a hand of like only trap cards or something, or like something like Foolish Burial plus like a trap card. That's still combo, because Rhinoheart can send a trap from your hand to the graveyard. It doesn't have to just send a monster. That's something important to remember, just in case you want to trigger your trap effects right away, or if you don't have a monster in hand, you can still resolve the Rhinoheart and go off with your regular combo from there. The next interaction I want to talk about is with Plant Dracostapelia. This is one of the most common fusions that the Tearlaments deck is going to end with. And it's important to remember that with this card, after you place the counter, even if it gets removed from the field, as long as the monster has the counter, its level is still going to be 1, because that's an inherent effect of the Predaplant counter and not Dragostapelia's effect. So while the activated effects won't be negated, Dragostapelia will still make it so that monster is level 1 as long as they have the counter on it. The next card I want to talk about is Time Thief Redoer. Time Thief Redoer is a very common end part of the Tearlaments board. Whether you're playing it or playing against it, you just expect to see this card a lot. What I want to remind you guys of is that you can actually Ash Blossom Time Thief Redoer's effect regardless of whether it has a spell under it or not, just because there is always the possibility of a spell being put under it before the chain resolves. So since it doesn't detach for cost, it means that you can use cards like Ghost Ogre as well on it, and to my knowledge it won't resolve because it won't have a chance to detach the material, since it doesn't detach for cost once again. So that's important to remember. Your hand traps can be pretty high impact against Time Thief Redoer, even when you're drawing it as your 6th card, for example. Next up, I'm going to be talking about Kaleido Heart. Now, Kaleido Heart is one of the most powerful fusions in the Tearlaments deck, and it's very important to remember. The very first line of it says, cannot be used as a fusion material, which means if your opponent takes it, they can't polymerization it away, for example. They can't attempt to Tearlaments fusion it away. They can't super polymerization it, most importantly of all, and you can't attempt to put it back with like a Tearlaments monster in order to summon out another fusion monster, just because it can't be used as a fusion material. However, if you, for example, have gotten rid of the Kaleido Heart and it's gone to your grave without being able to come back, a card like Kikalos can bring it back. Kikalos, of course, can bring back any Tearlaments monster from your hand or grave, and that includes Kaleido Heart. So this is something important to remember. Once you lose that Kaleido Heart, it's not gone forever as long as it's in your graveyard. It's very easily able to be brought back with a card like Kikalos. Speaking of Kikalos, Kikalos' second effect, to where you can target one monster you control and to special summon one Tearlaments monster from your hand or graveyard, actually doesn't require you to successfully destroy the monster. What I mean by that is, say for example you activate Kikalos effect, on itself, let's say, attempting to special summon a monster from your hand or grave, and your opponent chains a card like Sprite Smashers, or chains a card like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. Even though Kikalos is no longer on the field, it'll still be able to resolve because it only needs to summon in order to destroy. So it first summons and then it destroys the card. So it's not the other way around. And that's something important to remember, which means if you're playing against this deck, you probably want to preemptively remove the Kikalos in some way if that's what you plan to do. Just so they won't have the ability to be able to summon a monster for free from their hand or from their graveyard. Next up, moving on to the field spell specifically, there's quite a few things I want to talk about when you're playing against this deck and when you're playing this deck. With the field spell, you can actually attempt to destroy your own Kikalos because Perlarino doesn't just have to destroy one of your opponent's monsters. So say, for example, you're in a situation where Kikalos is the only play that you have, and you're afraid your opponent has something like Ash Blossom or Impermanence. You can activate Primeval Planet to attempt to destroy Kikalos after using its effect, which means so even if your opponent negates it with like Veiler, Imperm, or Ash Blossom, destroying it and sending it to the graveyard still allows you to send the top 5 cards of your deck to the grave, which can be good if you have no other plays in your hand, just because it gives you a chance to keep playing at the very minimum. It's also important to remember that you can also do the same thing with a card like Tearlaments Kaleido Heart. The field spell can destroy your own Kaleido Heart to trigger its effect, summoning itself back from the grave by dumping a Tearlaments card from your deck to the graveyard, which can not only either trigger its effect again if you haven't used it that turn, or at worst, it helps you, let's say, push for damage, for example. Just because you're getting a free Tearlament card in the graveyard, that can be sending a monster to get a free fusion summon, or sending a card like Sulik in order to add a extra Tearlaments monster from your deck to your hand. Either way, just remember that Pellerito can actually destroy your own cards too, so that's not only limited to like a card like Kaleido Heart or Kikalos. You can also destroy your own trap cards like Sulik and Meta Noise if you really need to, so just keep that in mind. It's a very versatile field spell that has a lot of value on the board even after you use its effect to add from your deck to your hand. Also important to remember, while you have the field spell up, playing it up against your opponent, if they remove your stuff by shuffling it back into the deck somehow, so with a card like an opposing Kaleido Heart or with a card like Nightmare Unicorn, you can actually still trigger the Primeval Planet as well, because you don't have to be the one shuffling away the cards. As long as they're shuffled back into the deck somehow, you're still able to get the Pellerino effect, and that can be huge because it makes it so your cards like Kaleido Heart are a lot more difficult to out, and your opponent has to find different ways in order to out it without triggering your field spell. Finally, I'm going to be talking about specifically Tearlaments Sulik. Sulik actually negates the monster permanently, so even if like after the turn is ended, you've already sent the monster and the monster is still on the board, it still remains negated, just because it just doesn't specify until the end of the turn. That's a great thing about Sulik, and that can be important when you're, let's say, facing like a Floodgate monster like Window, for example. It'll just remain negated as long as its Sulik has successfully resolved on it. Another tip with Sulik specifically, I would recommend searching Sulik into matchups where you have no idea what your opponent has. If you're deciding between a card like Meta Noise or Sulik, I would definitely go for Sulik, and the reason for that is because Sulik is just good into most, if not all, matchups out there, whereas Meta Noise doesn't really have such a high impact against like the Mirror Match, for example, or a deck like Fluanderies. It just isn't that great tournament because it doesn't necessarily stop them from accomplishing their plays, whereas Sulik can actually do that. Finally, regarding the traps, with Sulik and Meta Noise, you actually have to successfully perform the action that's listed on the card. So for example, you have to successfully set your opponent's monster face down, and you have to successfully negate your opponent's monster in order to be able to send the Tearlements card either from your deck or from your field to the graveyard. Why that's important is because if you're playing against the deck, you can actually chain something to remove your own monster that your opponent is targeted with these cards, making it so the traps won't be able to resolve. So for example, let's say I have a level 2 monster on the board. My opponent activates Meta Noise targeting the level 2. If I change something like Sprite Smashers getting rid of that level 2 monster, I can actually make it so Meta Noise won't resolve because it didn't successfully set my monster face down. A similar idea with Tearlaments Sulik, it does need to successfully negate the monster's effect in order to be able to send the Tearlements. So something important to remember, these traps can be played around, and definitely you need to watch out for how your opponent is structuring their turn in order to use these traps as effectively as possible. For this next section of the video, I'm going to be going over some of the combos that you can do with the Tearlaments deck. I can't possibly go over every single one because there is some sort of variance in every single game that you play with this deck, so the combo lines are going to be a little different every time, but the one of the few combo lines that is always guaranteed to be the same is the Rhino Heart. So we're going to start by normal summoning our Tearlaments Rhino Heart, allowing us to send any Tearlaments monster from our deck to the graveyard. So we're going to just send a random one. I'm sending Merely in this case, but it could be anyone, it doesn't really matter. Activating that Tearlaments monster effective fusion summon, putting itself and the Rhino Heart back to the bottom of your deck to summon a Kikalos. Now Kikalos' effect triggers to allow you to add any Tearlaments card from your deck to the grave, or send any Tearlaments card from your deck to the graveyard. So there are a few lines you can go here. If you're trying to set up like a trap, for example, you get to grab Meta Noise or Soliak, and both will be live just because you have the Tearlaments monster on the board. Most commonly, you will probably see Meta Noise being added, and what that entails is a Book of Moon on your opponent's turn, and then Meta Noise allows you to send any Tearlaments monster from your deck to the graveyard, and that can either fuse for another copy of Kikalos to search for follow-up if you decide that the Book of Moon is enough, or you can summon a card like Dragostapelia as an additional form of interruption off of just a single Rhino Heart. So that means you get access to a Book of Moon plus a Dragostapelia on the board off of just a single Rhino Heart, and that can be incredibly good, considering that you only needed to commit one card to that play. But with a card like Soliak, you also have the option to negate your opponent's monster and try to go for mills with Kikalos. So you can send this to the graveyard and send the top 5 cards of your deck to the grave. So that you can see why I'm saying like you're not always guaranteed to get stuff, because this is some sort of there is some sort of variance involved with this. You're not always going to hit a name, but with the Soliak play, you do have the chance to have a higher ceiling with what you're hitting with your Kikalos. You can hit multiple names, for example, and you can make multiple fusions, and that would in theory be better than the Meta Noise. But if you're trying to play it safe and minimize variance, Meta Noise is probably the way to go. Also because the Book of Moon effect is something that not a lot of decks have access to, and it's difficult for some decks, for example like Sprite, to play through, as opposed to something like just negating their monster. So it's something important to keep in mind off of just a single Kikalos. Continuing with just the single Kikalos, you also have a very viable option to search a specifically Tearlaments Merely. Activate Kikalos, targeting itself to destroy it and summon the Merely from hand. And what that means is Kikalos is going to be able to send the top 5 cards of your deck to the grave. Merely is going to send the top 3 cards from your deck to the graveyard. So if you're playing a deck that has a lot of good mills in it, like let's say you pair Tearlaments with like something else, for example, this can be the line that you want to go down, just because you have access to 8 mills, which is not something a lot of decks can say they have access to. You of course have the potential to hit more Tearlaments names than if you just went for the safer play turn 1. You also have the potential, for example, if you have a way to remove them merely from the board with the card effect later on with like Polymerization or something, you have a bunch of cards in the graveyard that you can fuse with as well. So you can go down this line if you feel you value the mills a lot more, or if you just want to roll the dice and see how lucky you are. Finally, Kikalos can also just very simply send the Tearlaments to the graveyard, put itself and the Tearlaments back for Dragostapelia. Now, why would you ever do this? You would do this over something like the Meta Noise play, even though Meta Noise grants you the same end board with the additional Book of Moon, because if you want to play around, let's say your opponent's having like a back row removal card or something, or if they have draw like Ash Blossom for turn, they're able to remove the Meta Noise or nullify it before you're actually able to send the Tearlaments card, which means if you guaranteed want a Dragostapelia, you can just go for that line instead. Alright, the next combo I'm going to be going over is Supreme Sea Mare plus any Tearlaments card or monster. So for those of you who don't know what Supreme Sea Mare does, is if it's normal or special summoned, you can send one aqua monster from your deck to the grave except for itself. So if you consider just seeing Supreme Sea Mare alone, it essentially is the same as the Rhino Heart combo. You can go for any of the options that I mentioned in the previous Rhino Heart combo, but if you pair that with any Tearlaments monster, so like it can be Rhino Heart, it can be any of the ones that I've used, it doesn't matter which, you just need the name in your hand, you actually end on a very interesting and very powerful board that you may not expect off a card like Supreme Sea Mare. So Supreme Sea Mare on normal summon is going to send any Tearlaments to the graveyard, doesn't matter which, we're just using it to fuse away itself and the Tearlaments monster in our hand. for a copy of Kekalos. Kekalos effect is going to be able to add specifically this time Tearlaments Rhino Heart from our deck to our hand. The reason we're doing this is because we want to get the Rhino Heart onto the board, with Kekalos' effect targeting itself, specifically itself, to destroy it and summon out the Rhino Heart. Here, optionally, you can use Kekalos' effect to mill 5 from the top of your deck to the grave to try to hit more names, but for the sake of this combo, we're just not going to show that because, of course, there is variance involved with that. All we're going to use is the Rhino Heart effect. Rhino Heart will send one of the tearelements that you haven't used yet, so let's say we start with Merrily, we'll just end up sending Shiren to the graveyard. Shiren or whatever, or Havness, if you sent it, is going to be able to put these 2 back and summon out a copy of Predaplant Dragostapelia. And now from here, since you have 2 level 4s on the board, you can actually turn them into a card like 10th Thief Redoer, or any rank 4, it doesn't really matter. You can summon Abyss Dweller as well, depending on the matchup. You can also go for a play like Bahamut Shark into Totally Awesome, because both are water monsters. Those are just some of the options that you can go with, but essentially this is Supreme Sea Mare plus any Tearlaments monster in your hand equals a Dragostapelia plus any rank 4 that you want, or hypothetically like a Link 2 if you want, but usually going first, the rank 4 is just going to be a lot better most of the time. So yeah, that's one reason why some builds may be playing the Supreme Sea Mare. Essentially, it adds more consistency to the deck by acting as more copies of Rhino Heart. So if you feel that your deck is lacking consistency, let's say you don't have access to 3 copies of the field spell, for example, you could consider playing Supreme Sea Mare. Of course, the downsides of Supreme Sea Mare are that it isn't a Tearlaments monster, which means let's say your Supreme Sea Mare gets stopped and you have one of the Tearlaments trap cards, it's not going to be able to do anything because it doesn't have the name. Also, it doesn't do anything when it's sent to the graveyard like Rhino Heart, but on the flip side of that, not only does it act as an extra copy of Rhino Heart, it also gives you a higher ceiling with like the rank 4 plus Dragostapelia play like I mentioned, but also just worst case it's an Aqua in the graveyard that if you mill it with your Tearlaments, you have an extra name to put back so that you don't have to put one from your hand or field to the graveyard. Most builds aren't playing it, but this is just something you guys may want to keep in mind. If you see Supreme Sea Mare against your opponent, this is kind of what you can expect with the card. It's better for, like, let's say a budget version of the deck if you decide to go down that route. Alright, so that's gonna do it for the Tearlaments guide. Hopefully you guys learned something new, whether you're new to the deck, a veteran with the deck, trying to play against the deck at locals or something, or going to a big tournament and piloting it yourself. I hope you were able to learn something useful. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, let me know by leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing. Let me know in the comment section below if you think there's anything else that Tearlament players should know or people should know about the Tearlaments deck, and I'll definitely respond to the ones I feel are really good. But with that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.